But like many people around the country, I'm coming to you from my home office, not from Rutgers University, but very happy to see everyone. And as we've been saying, so happy that we're moving into this format, because I think it'll be much more conducive to the sort of discussion we hope to have. Certainly, and I'll introduce my colleagues in a moment, but certainly when we crafted our proposal, we were really motivated to offer this roundtable, given the political climate we were in, given what we foresaw as a contentious campaign coming up. Like all of us, never could we have imagined the state where we were with that we would be in this position right now. Recognizing we're in the midst of a global health crisis and the tremendous ramifications that has had, and the unequal ramifications that has had across citizens across the country. The reckoning that's taking place across the country right now in the Black Lives Matter movement, the remote instruction that we're all engaging in some way, shape, or form, and then certainly heading into a political campaign and election like one we've never seen before. So if we already thought there was good reason to hold this roundtable on how to teach civic engagement, certainly I think there's the conditions we are facing currently and will be facing are even more challenging than we envisioned, but certainly the work of teaching civic engagement is probably more critical than ever. So we're really pleased that you're all here with us today. And we're going to have a discussion, and I want to invite, introduce our panelists first. The four of us have collaborated for some time now. We're trying to, it seems like quite a while, but we've been collaborating for the last few years on a series of textbooks that have been published by the American Political Science Association. I just happen to have them right here. One entitled Teaching Civic Engagement from Student to Active Citizen. The other is Teaching Civic Engagement Across the Disciplines. So two textbooks, edited volumes that lay out theoretical frameworks as well as a set of best practices on how to teach civic engagement, not just in political science classrooms, but in classrooms across disciplines and across campus. We're in the process right now of a third book called Teaching Civic Engagement Globally, because we certainly recognize some of the challenges, many of the challenges we are facing here regarding teaching democratic citizenship are not unique to the United States, but are being faced globally. So joined in this effort, and will be joining us today, is Alison Rios Millett McCartney. And Alison is a professor of political science at Towson University. We have Elizabeth Bennion, who is professor of political science at Indiana University, South Bend, and as of last night, the president of the newly created Civic Engagement section, so congratulations on that, Elizabeth. And Dick Simpson, who is professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Chicago. So I'm thrilled that we're all able to present this roundtable today. And as far as a format, we're going to, I have a few prepared questions that our roundtable participants will respond to. Certainly it's not going to be extensive PowerPoint use, but we have a few slides that we thought would make it a little easier for our participants just to get across a few terms, some concepts, but certainly this is going to be much more of a discussion. And towards that end, please feel free, I'll do my best, but please do feel free to use the chat box. I'm going to use the chat box. One thing I neglected to mention that I want to point out is that the two edited volumes published by the American Political Science Association, there's a companion website that I edit that not only houses supplementary materials to these texts, but also is a dynamic resource and offers resources to political scientists, but really faculty from all disciplines who are interested in teaching civic engagement. So if you have a question that you want to include in the chat, or you have a resource that you think would be valuable, please feel free to use it. And then, once we've all been able to kind of give our say, we'll open up for discussion. And we actually welcome the opportunity for discussion. And the last thing I'll mention is, this is just sort of an overview. And tomorrow at the Teaching and Learning Conference, we are going to be actually offering a workshop that does a little bit of a deeper dive on these topics, offers real hands-on resources. We'll be sharing resources with participants. So if you're intrigued today and want to learn more, please definitely join our TLC workshop tomorrow. And, quick shout out, I think your cat must have heard, Mary, cat must have heard about the puppy cam and was jealous. So we will also be admiring your cat in the midst of it all. Okay, so thank you again for joining us. I'm going to start by handing or asking a question, posing a question to my colleague, Alison McCartney, and hoping she could start our discussion. You know, we don't know, and we know some people on this call, not everyone, we don't know necessarily how familiar our participants are with the topic of civic engagement. How does one define civic engagement? What do we mean by teaching civic engagement? So I'm going to ask Alison at the outset if she could just help all of us understand when we're talking about civic engagement, what the term means and what we need to know when we're going about teaching it. Alison, and I think Alison's going to be sharing her screen.
So thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate that. Let me go ahead and share my screen here, and if you'll all be patient for just a second while I make sure that that works correctly. Yay, okay, all right. So go on, slideshow. Okay, here we are. So just to get us started, and again, make sure that we are all on the same page here about what exactly we're talking about. So this slide looks at what is civic engagement pedagogy. We need to recall, first of all, it is an evidence-based pedagogy. This is not something we're pulling out of somewhere because it sounds cool or it seems fun or whatever it is. No, there's substantial evidence in the two books that we've written, some other books, and the Journal of Political Science Education has a number of articles that are providing the evidence for the effectiveness and the impacts of this kind of pedagogy. It does include civic learning and focuses on building civic skills, knowledge, and experience. And that experience component makes it different from traditional political science classes. It also works on building this sense of efficacy for productive participation in our communities, hopefully to make them lifelong participants in their community. So not just about one semester and one shot, one-off things, but to build a foundation for valuing, knowing how to do it, knowing what you're doing, and for valuing this participation. It always includes some sort of active learning component. Now, that's often confused with service learning. Service learning is one type of active learning or experiential learning, and some of us do service learning, but that is not required. So some sort of active learning component. And this next point about fostering deep and substantial participation, not shallow drive-by forms of participation, as Harwood and Shea wrote in a chapter in our 2013 book. And that's, of course, something that we've been battling against with Facebook, everybody just liking something, right, without really engaging deeply. But it can also be local, regional, national, or global, or global in scope. So some important distinctions here: it is not volunteering. Some of the early attempts at civic engagement education really floundered in the volunteer trap. And Rick Battistoni and others brought us out of that, fortunately, in the late 90s, and worked on drawing some of these important distinctions between civic engagement education and volunteering. And here you see that volunteering is distinction is it's on the emphasis on the benefits to community. There's not necessarily a connection to a class or any of your traditional learning goals. And it doesn't necessarily have examination of our structures, relationships, or anything that's like, okay, why do we need to, volunteer at the soup kitchen? What are the problems behind it? Reflection is not required, and it can just be a one-time event. So it could be longer than that. But again, volunteering is not connected back and tied explicitly back to your traditional learning goals, and civic engagement should be. Now, you can have civic engagement, or it can morph into political engagement pedagogy. And that's where you're getting into explicitly politically oriented activities. So, for example, civic engagement could be about learning about environmental politics, and it brings up a recycling program and so forth. But when you take that recycling program and then talk about laws that you want created, rules to be created, or how you're going to influence the political structures about those laws, then you get into political engagement pedagogy. Political engagement pedagogy seeks a direct impact, as I write, on political issues, systems, relationships, and structures. And it always has a political learning goal, although, to be very clear, not necessarily partisan. This is not partisan education, okay? It is education about politics. Let me add that civic engagement education also should not be an add-on, something you just kind of pop on as some little fun thing, like, adding a cherry on top, or something like that. So it should be embedded in the learning goals of the class. The goals of civic engagement pedagogy. Again, when you're thinking about how do I structure a good civic engagement course, you know, the goals are to deepen the learning of core disciplinary skills and knowledge through practice. It is political science. A lot of people are like, no, 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 it's not political science. Yes, it is, or it should be. You're really trying to create knowledge and deepen the knowledge about political science, about how it connects to, how it impacts and is impacted by the community, regardless of how you define that community. It also works on what should be a political science goal for everybody, which is expanding students' information literacy, an important critical thinking skill that is woefully absent in today's politics. We also look at developing their sense of confidence and their ability to apply their skills and knowledge. This is an important component because if they have the skills and knowledge but cannot activate it or do not feel the sense of efficacy that I can take my skills and knowledge and bring it to the community, then we're not fully there. So we need to make them lifelong learners. They need to know that they can take what's here in their heads and they can bring it forward to engage with their community. Now, for the individual, we are also looking at building this foundation for lifelong participation. And for the country, though, for our, whatever their community is, we're talking about fostering the redevelopment of knowledgeable, capable, and engaged citizenry. So they're not just individual goals for the student, but they're also important goals for our universities and our political institutions. So we're trying to contribute to the larger political sense. So it's political science, so we always need some sort of equation. So here you go. Here's your equation. When you think about it, some people think better this way. Knowledge plus practice and skills equals deeper knowledge plus advocacy and values equals hopefully informed active citizens, gives us hopefully a stable, effective democracy, or at least a better shot at that. For more on some of this stuff, we'll talk about the Teaching Civic Engagement books, but remember, you always want to connect the goals of the pedagogy to your class readings and assignments. Again, embedding what you're doing throughout the class. It should permeate it, not be some sort of add-on. So there's the answer to the first question, and I'll stop sharing them.
Okay, cardinal rule. No, don't forget to unmute yourself if you're hosting a roundtable discussion. Mm-hmm. So with that foundational knowledge, you know, Alison, as you well know, the first textbook, the Teaching Civic Engagement from Student to Active mm-hmm. Citizen, so much of the tenor of that book was to encourage our fellow political scientists to take on the job to engage in this work of teaching civic engagement. Certainly mm-hmm. in the second book, you know, encouraging faculty from all disciplines to be doing the same. As I mentioned in my introduction, you know, we are heading into an unprecedented semester. We're all in the midst of an unprecedented semester, looking ahead to an unprecedented election. What would you say then to our fellow political scientists and really scholars from all disciplines about why this moment in particular, teaching civic engagement, is so important?
So first of all, everybody hold on to your hats, take a deep breath, and yes, we are living in interesting times, but these interesting times show more than ever, whether it was just the pandemic or just the political situation, we would still be in just as much of a need of civic engagement education for all of our students. We need to remember that in political science, we do touch a wider range of students than just majors. In our intro classes that often serve gen ed or core, whatever you call it in your institution, for some of these students, it's the only chance they have to engage in politics. So hopefully it is embedded at different levels of the discipline, and you aren't just waiting for the majors, but you're also catching other students as they go through. Because this is our shot. Political science has a monopoly on the knowledge. Okay, this is what we do, right? We have a monopoly of the knowledge about our political processes, our institutions, and so forth. And we need to bring that to the larger community. But more importantly, we need to think about the future. We need to think about not only the current of our country, but the future. And I propose that we need to rebuild our democracy. And we need to rebuild it with geographically, demographically, professionally, and politically diverse people who hold a wide variety of viewpoints and have a wide variety of experiences, and who are educated in how government works, how problems can be peacefully confronted, and how we can work together to find mutually beneficial solutions. Civically engaged citizens who are willing and capable of pursuing the mutual gains through cooperation with society, and within government. These are the future that this country must have to survive and thrive, not only in 2020, but well beyond.
Thank you, Alison. Let's move on to Elizabeth Bennion. So Elizabeth, if we're going to inspire everyone as a result of this roundtable or our workshop tomorrow to go back into their classrooms and teach civic engagement, we certainly want them to be doing it in an evidence-based way, in a way that we know is effective based on research that's been conducted. So you have led a number of field experiments, research efforts aimed at really developing these evidence-based approaches to teaching civic engagement. So as we have faculty who want to support students this fall, want to support their civic and political learning this fall, what are some practices you might recommend, or at least some directions to head as far as incorporating these instructional techniques into their classroom?
Sure. Well, one of the things is that we cannot assume that merely conveying knowledge automatically translates into civic skills or civic action. And so there are many times where people will point to the correlation that we see in large regression models that say the more you know about politics, the more engaged you are. But then they draw the wrong conclusion, which is to say all we need to do if we want to create active citizens and residents of this country is to give people more knowledge. And in fact, we see that although these two are correlated, if you actually want people to get out there and get engaged, the treatments that involve actual skill development, actual practice of those skills are more powerful in generating actual results. And so I think that is one important finding, not to assume that students will figure it out themselves. And also that they will translate what you say about US government to the state level and to the local level without any information of how to do that, without any going to or observing a city council or a county council member, or having a state legislator come in, watching it online. I mean, those are not things that we teach about in our classes. And so as we think about creating active citizens and creating citizens and residents who actually can make a meaningful difference in their communities, there are a lot of practical skills that people need. And so one of the things we see consistently in the research, and it's interesting to see people present this and be like, wow, I just don't know why they didn't develop a sense of trust in government. And I don't know why they didn't all get out and get active in their communities after I taught them about the 3 branches. And it wasn't connected. And so I think that's really important as both part of, as we set up any scholarship of teaching and learning strategies, saying, what is the learning objective here? How do I match a specific activity to that? And then what will I use to assess that? That they have to match up. And so we see that in study after study where people get these surprising results that really aren't so surprising if you think about how people learn. And there's a huge body of literature on the utility of repetition, but also on practice and linking also knowledge to emotion, that they feel passionately about something that's going to stick with you. And so the whole new science of learning literature outside of political science also reminds us that this is incredibly important. And the other thing is just avoiding conventional wisdom. So one of the reasons I started doing those field experiments was being at conferences of people who were really interested in getting students registered to vote or engaged in the electoral process. And they had set up really admirable but very challenging programs to staff on their university campuses. So they were convinced that you absolutely had to have a peer in every classroom to make a classroom registration presentation effective. And I asked how they knew that, and they said, well, we've had several students tell us how meaningful it was to have their peers present. But that's anecdotal, right? And we're social scientists. And so that is when my colleague, David Nickerson, and I created that field experiment with 16 campuses and about 23,000 students to say, wait a minute, if we randomly assign you to not get a presentation with a professor, and get a presentation by a student, does it matter? Is it hearing it from a peer, or is it getting the education, being a captive audience, having someone who will help you fill out that form and deliver it? And it turns out it's the latter. On some campuses with really strong peer-to-peer culture, they were marginally more effective at the peer, but not statistically significant. Similarly, campuses that didn't have much of a student life or a robust student culture, we did see some more effectiveness actually from the expert, right, from the professor. But that difference was not statistically significant. What was statistically significant was the fact that having that captive audience, having that classroom presentation resulted in more registrations and more votes. And that's not based on student self-report or their feelings about it, but their actual voting behavior. And we know if they got the presentation, we know who delivered it, and we know what the result was in terms of their registration, and did they show up on the voter files, and did they actually show up at the polls. And so that is the sort of evidence-based practice that I'm talking about. And we did that similarly with emails. Like the universities wanted to say, we're fulfilling our legal obligation by giving every student, enrolled student, a voter registration form. We sent an email. So we tested to see if this was at all effective. And of course, it was completely ineffective. And they linked them to a PDF to go and print and find a stamp if they knew what one was and mail it, you know, just not effective at all. And in fact, when we combined all of our over 250,000 students with another, the only other study that David had done previously, we got a slight negative effect. And what we think happened there is they're passing up the registration tables where they would have actually gotten registered. Oh, I have it in my inbox, but they don't follow through. And so knowing what works and what doesn't work is important. Now you can make it a bit more effective if you link them directly to an online voter registration system. This is small effects, about a 1.2% percentage point increase in registration, right? A 0.1 percentage point on votes, but that's 7 votes for every 1,000, and it's so cheap to do, you could do it, just don't make it your only thing. So, you know, I mean, so finding out what works, what doesn't. And so there's this whole body of literature that I've had students be field workers to discover some of this stuff, like going out in neighborhoods where, you know, that face-to-face really works. But if you're just having the campaigns do it, they reach out to the older voters. So my students were incredibly successful in getting older voters to the polls, our younger voters, but had no effect on the olders. Well, the older people were already being canvassed. So then the other thing is, okay, so, but what about what do students get out of that? We know that the neighborhood was mobilized, which is good, right? But what do they get out of that? So you can pre-post study your students, have them reflect and write about it, do a survey, and see what it is that they, you know, did they find it valuable? Did they learn anything? Have some direct measures of their learning as well as some indirect feeling measures. And it turns out, although they really do not like the idea of that kind of activity ahead of time, they're incredibly glad and feel incredibly proud of themselves and more connected to their community and more connected to each other after they've done it. And we see this pretty consistently in the literature about these type of hands-on engaged learning activities. Not every student will like it, but many who are nervous about it ahead of time find it to be some of the most meaningful experiences that they've had, and that learning sticks with them. And so I just think it's critically important as people look at the Teaching Civic Engagement books. One thing they'll see is some people are doing legal clinics, some people looking at asylum cases and having students study country conditions and interview people. Some people are having practicums or community-based research that they do on issues like poverty. Right? There's so many different things that people have done, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think that would be my big message. And some people are going to talk about what didn't work, so you don't have to make the same mistake. Some people are talking about what did work. And so
sometimes I think failing is a learning opportunity.
Absolutely. And that's important for us to share our results with each other for that reason.
And Elizabeth, I'm putting in the chat box, you know, you had referenced the importance of linking your learning objectives to your activities, to your assessment. That's in chapter 22 of Teaching Civic Engagement Across the Disciplines, and I make reference to that chapter all the time in my own teaching. And then before we move on to Dick, Elizabeth, maybe you could talk a little bit about, so you've given us some good ideas for what faculty can be doing in the classroom. You've also done a good amount of research on actions that campus-wide actions that can take place. There's been some really good research on campus culture and the importance of campus culture at being conducive or supporting, encouraging political learning and engagement. Can you give everyone maybe a nail sketch too on best practices, or what kind of campuses foster that sense of political and civic learning?
Well, one of the chapters that we have in the Teaching Civic Engagement books is out of the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education, and really their Politics 365 model. Now, Nancy Thomas and I have talked about how the model could use some additional investigations and robust sort of randomization, but that's hard to do. Like tell a campus, you do this and you don't do this. You could do it perhaps through grants. So this is qualitative work, but it does have a quantitative component. And both of those are really important in this kind of work. We want to learn not only what works in terms of numbers, so looking at which campuses were the most likely to actually engage in politics, and particularly as measured by voting behavior, and which were least. So they look at positive and negative outliers, and they norm it for the demographics of the campus. Where would we expect them to come in, and who comes in really high and really low? And then they went and they talked to them to see what's common here. And really they interviewed not just administrators, but also faculty, staff, students, to really see, is there anything common in those positive and those negative outliers? And one of the biggest things they found was this idea of diversity as a actual realized practice where it's appreciated, and people on the campus learn to value the opinions and ideas of others. The fact that there are pervasive political discussions, the notion that your campus actually gives students some control, so they practicing those active civic leadership skills on campus. One campus, the students were the only ones who had the keys to a building. And so those kind of things where students are practicing democracy really matter. And then, you know, I'm sure Dick Simpson will talk about it, but making sure that the campus is on board with all your different deadlines, so that everybody's doing something and encouraging students to do things on Constitution Day, on Vote Early Day, on the voter registration deadline, on all throughout the year. You have things, election or no election, where you can build in a community, debate watch parties, etc. Where that's happening a lot and students are telling each other, inviting each other to participate, you build that momentum and that engagement, versus campuses where a student really actively has to seek out other students who are already interested in politics.
So definitely, we put a couple references or resources in the chat box, but we're speaking about Nancy Thomas, who is the director of the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education at Tufts University. And there are a number of resources on her website, but this notion of campus culture, this research on the importance of campus culture, is featured in the book that we edited, but she's done so much work, and we may reference it actually when we're speaking later about discussion and moderating discussions on your campus. Let's turn to Dick Simpson. And Dick, you know, you have had demonstrated success on your campus in successfully engaging students, and you have a host of practical suggestions. Elizabeth referenced a few of them, but practical suggestions that faculty administrators can follow. If you were to give us a set of tips, what might they be? And you may even have them in a PowerPoint.
Hopefully I do.
Okay.
We'll see if I can
Assuming
get it up,
you can share your screen.
Yes, that's the next problem.
Okay, you should be able to, hopefully.
Oh, I'm having trouble. Let me try sharing screen first. Here we go.
Yep. Let's see. Oh, Alison, I think you need to take yours. There we go. Okay, I think we see it.
So there are a couple of things. One of them that Elizabeth Matto talked about was that it is important to coordinate on the campus. And as Elizabeth Bennion talked about, it's important to have common objectives and timetables. So this is just a list of the kinds of things that could be being done between now and essentially November 3rd, although Inauguration Day is January 20th. You can do all sorts of class credit and extra credit things. Right now, this was inaccurate. I changed it on the other slide, but not back on this one. The census opportunity ends at the end of this month. So students have the opportunity to work together with organizations in the community to get people to fill out the census. That actually ends up in meaning millions of dollars of funding for your state if they do it, your city if you're in a city. It ends up, depending on how many congressmen you'll have. In Illinois, we'll lose a second congressman if we're undercounted. We're going to lose one anyway, but we might lose two. Constitution Day, I view, and I think most people do who do the civic engagement work, as sort of the kickoff of the year. You can, and that's coming next week. We're actually celebrating it on the 16th because of some logistical reasons having to do with when we can get the speaker and when we have our classes meeting. But at UIC, we have from 200 to 400 people. Normally, this time we're going to have more because it's being sponsored by the law school as well, and we're inviting the alumni. And it is, I view it as the starting gun. This is the start of the race until November 3rd. You have all the student registration, voter registration. I'm going to talk in a minute about a National Student Issues Convention, speakers, debate parties, and so forth. What you need to do on every campus, and as I do in our political science department, is get everyone to agree on at least 5, 6 things that are going to happen, and to get everybody to do them on the same day, so that it's not just my class that's required to go to Constitution Day. The other classes in political science, particularly the American government classes, are required to go to Constitution Day. So you can make a tremendous impact just by making a list. And in our case, and in most of the cases that were being referred to by Elizabeth Bennion of the studies of campuses that succeed in civic engagement, there is some sort of core group of faculty and students, but equally importantly, administrators who control resources, coordinating together, agreeing on which of these things you're going to do. Which ones of them you choose is really much less important than the fact that you're doing it as a common endeavor. And hopefully that's what we call that list, is a civic action plan. It requires university support. It requires, as I say, faculty, administrators, and students, and it requires specific goals. And that becomes an action plan. It's an action plan that's simple between now and November 3rd, but if you're planning for the rest of the year, then you have to sit down and think, well, what are we going to do Inauguration Day? What are we going to do next spring when we're teaching remote and there is, in fact, no election? What happens then? And there are answers to all of that, but working it out collaboratively is important. And then I particularly wanted to highlight and invite all of you to join us for the 2020 National Issues Convention. It's a student convention. It will be on October 16th. The Central Standard Time is noon to 3 p.m. Obviously, everybody's learned to translate into all the different time zones now. And it's going to be by Zoom. And we already have about 10 universities who've signed up to do it, from Michigan, some from the East Coast, from Illinois, and so forth. And I'll just very briefly tell you a little bit of how it works. It's got 3 main components. We meet in small groups of 20 students or 25, and they discuss what's most important. Is immigration more important? Is the racial conflict more important? Not the politics, but just what is the most important issue? And they come up with several, maybe as many as 3 in their small group. Then they meet as a plenary, and we're hoping 1,000 students will be part of this, and vote on, of all of these proposals, and some of them are pretty predictable and some of them are really surprising. Sometimes you learn about things. The first time I ever heard about Dreamers was at a National Student Issues Convention, because the students were saying, hey, this is really important, before anybody had ever heard the term in the general public. And once we voted on 5 issues, these are the 5 important things to students. And it's not by us telling the students, it's by the students telling us and the public and everyone else. Then candidates and public officials are not allowed to give their stump speech, but they have to respond to the issues. If students said immigration is the most important, what are they going to do about immigration? And then after the convention is over, the students can mobilize to try and get the issues they cared about actually implemented. And I only mention those as a way of beginning to understand how we put this together outside of our individual class. Yeah, a lot of our textbooks and the rest talk about, you know, how do you have a good discussion in the class? How do you use speakers and so forth? And I suspect a lot of our discussion in this session will be about that. But I think the big jump is from the individual class to the campus and how you mobilize instead of the 20 students in the class or the 50 or the 100, how do you mobilize? My campus is 33,000 students. If I can mobilize working together with my colleagues, some percentage of those, it will make a difference. And I'll give you a specific example. In 2012 at the UIC, 42% of our students voted. In 2016, 55% of our students voted. And we were going to go for 100% this year before the pandemic. Now we don't quite know, but we're certain we're going to beat our old record of 55%. We had the largest increase of any major university in the country between 2012 and 2016. Also in 2018, we doubled the vote over what we had done in 2014. You can make a huge difference once you begin to coordinate with enough colleagues and have what is called a civic action plan, that everybody's on the same page. All of the resources are being used, from the emails, which have the limited effect, to the much more bringing it up in class, which might have more effect. So I just wanted to talk about the sort of next level that we get to after we're successful in figuring out how to teach in our class.
Okay, thank you, Dick. And maybe we could stop sharing the screen. We'll see everyone's faces again. And then let's use this as an opportunity to just pause for a second. We've been talking at everyone for a while. So if we pause for a second and just stop and see, first of all, does anyone have any questions so far or want to make any contributions to the discussion as we're moving forward? And feel free to just unmute yourself, and it's a small enough group that you're welcome to just unmute yourself and offer a contribution if you have one or a question. Maureen?
Hi, thank you so much, all of you. Dick, just a question of clarification. This National Issues Convention, this is open to students on all campuses. So for example, if I wanted to introduce this opportunity to my students, can I link into that, or how does it work?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll put in the chat my email. All you have to do is send me an email saying it's, again, let me give you the time. It's October 16th. Okay. It's from noon to 3 Central Standard Time. So it's a 3-hour event. And we're trying to get individual classes like yours, Maureen, to join us. And so we have a good diverse group from across the country and different kinds of universities and different kinds of students. So all you have to do is send me an email. I will send you the details and the instructions of how to do it. We will try and select public officials from across the country that represent the areas where the most students are, wherever that turns out to be.
I see.
And Alison put something in the chat box because this is being co-sponsored, am I right, Dick, by APSA, and there are notices on APSA Educate, and so there's a URL that takes you to, there's a notice on APSA Educate with the information. But I know for myself, Maureen, so I think it's, you know, one of the positive developments, if we can identify some positive developments from this moment where we're all teaching remotely, is that it does allow opportunities that we wouldn't necessarily have had before. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I know I'm hoping to have about 20 students joining, and I've actually incorporated it into my syllabus, and they know at the beginning of the semester, I told them to save that Friday. And, you know, and it's something that's nice to build up to, and then certainly some good, you know, opportunities for conversation afterwards. Veronica offered a nice question that maybe we could respond to. What sources of funding do we all use for various events and activities? Elizabeth, do you want to talk about this first one that you've mentioned? Students learn, students vote? And you're muted, yep.
Sure.
Oh, you went off, somehow you muted again, Elizabeth, sorry. Not sure, there you go, okay.
I've worked for several years with Campus Election Engagement Project, the CEEP grant, which you can apply for money. In my case, it goes as a pass-through grant through Indiana Campus Compact. Campus Compact is national, and it works with faculty from all disciplines to get students civically engaged. But on election years, they work with the Campus Election Engagement Project, and they have small grants for voter registration, mobilization, and education activities. And this year, the CEEP grant was set up so you could get $1,000 for a student. That could be a scholarship, or it could be a stipend, or it could be hourly, depending on how your campus wanted to process it. I did a scholarship because my student who wanted to do the CEEP grant is already working with me on a work-study grant for some other election activities that we're doing. And so to maximize the compensation for her and to recognize her leadership and the fact that she's been with me a couple of years now, because we had a hiring freeze, which also meant we couldn't bump up our work-study students' pay, I did the scholarship. But that's been very, very helpful over the years. Students Learn, Students Vote is a wonderful coalition. They have switched from the Young Invincibles to the National Conference on Citizenship as their parent organization. And we actually got about $12,000 from them this year, which was what we had requested. That group has lots of different of the youth engagement, especially those focused on college students. A lot of those, it's an umbrella organization for a lot of those different groups. And they didn't ask every student program this year, which is really trying to do what they did on Dick's campus and at Northwestern and some of these other campuses, where you ask every student to register and to vote. And so that's been a challenge in the pandemic. So what they are advocating and what you had to propose to get the funding was how you were going to try to reach the most students possible. So working registration and education into existing processes. So on our campus, what we did was we got the people who are giving out those IDs. Now they're doing it in like a drive-through. You have to make an appointment because it's a pandemic. So we can't have these large gatherings. And so many things we'd like to do, we can't do. But they still had to pick up that ID. And so when they came to pick it up, they'd get a little thing from us about the voter registration deadline, about the website and a QR code to go, about also our website and where to find more information. And it's reminding them your Crimson card is a valid voter ID in the state of Indiana. So it kind of links it in. And then when they went to pick up their books, which again is not students being social in the bookstore, we're not allowed to set up hallway tables. So we couldn't do the normal things that we do. But the bookstore was willing, with every pre-order, which everybody is pre-ordering their books to pick up at the bookstore, they put a flyer in there with this kind of similar information. And this time, now you're registered for classes. Next is time to register to vote, right? So they're getting it there. And then in move-in day, they have a packet. We weren't allowed again to give out free food. We weren't allowed to have them stop at our table and chat. We weren't allowed to have them even stop even in an outdoor table at that time in our state. We couldn't even do that. But they have a move-in packet with like you must read this, you must sign this form. So there's a registration form. There's every direction about how to fill it out, right? There's all this information about us and our upcoming activities right there. So some people are getting it 3 times in the same day. Better 3 times than not at all. And then of course, working with courses. So students are in gen ed courses. So we reached out to the first year experience coordinator, the coordinator for the speech communication class that's required of every student at our university, the coordinator for the English composition class that's required of every student, and have them put the module that I made for Canvas Commons, like agree to put that in their class. Well, the students can be a civic engagement champion. I adapted the model a little from the national organization, but you have a Canvas model. You have pre-scripted announcements reminding students about deadlines. You have students zooming into their room to do presentations and talk about the importance of voting, or to register, talk to students through registering. So they have all these options. I have lectures where the whole class can opt in, or we can have a lecture during your class time that's about this voter education, voter registration, or a related topic. Like I'm presenting the case against the Electoral College, but still vote, right? So that's in the persuasive speaking class. They want an example of persuasive speech, so we might as well make it political. And so those are kind of things that Ask Every Student was encouraging us to do, and it was useful to have to put it on paper to get the money, right? And then have to follow through with that. So those kind of partnerships has been useful. The other thing, even if you don't have one of those grants and you think even in non-election years, our campus has over the last 2 years, I guess, had Academic Affairs decided they should do a work study fellowship because of the links to between work study and working on campus and retention. And if they can tie anything to retention, right, that's when they can find money even with limited resources. And so they really want them working with faculty. And so doing research with faculty or doing these kind of engagement activities. And so that's another way that you can possibly get some money if your department doesn't have it, is to convince Academic Affairs about this retention link, or convince your dean, and try to get some money to have people help you out, or give credit as a fieldwork course. And I've done it both ways. And I've even had a seminar where students are doing these kind of things for others. So I think there are lots of ways to design it depending on what your students need and are looking for and how they'll be motivated.
And I just want to, go ahead, Dick.
So the other thing I would remind you is there are probably more resources on your campus. My view is you should steal the money from the administration because they're not using it properly. So
speaking as a long-term administrator and Chicago politician who knows where the money's hidden.
And here we're used to stealing. But no, at your camp, for instance, we get a grant from an institute that is related to political and civic engagement for $15,000 to sponsor speaker series and the National Student Issues Convention and things like that. We get $2,000 from the Honors College. Alison is of course the money bags at her university. But from Student Affairs, we used to have to pay maybe $1,000 or $1,500 to get a room and everything because of the way they do bookkeeping at our university. So we got Student Affairs to waive it. We don't pay anything for when we do an event when we're actually using rooms. So the advantage of having your core group and knowing where the bodies are buried is you can go and get a lot of different small grants from different parts of the university. And it fulfills their mission. They feel good about it. That also then means the Honors College students are invited to come to the lectures. It's not just political science students, it's all those pre-med students and the rest. So I think you shouldn't overlook some very rich resources on your own campus that just don't have a label out front saying that this is civic engagement money.
One thing I just wanted to mention and amplify a comment that Catherine made is that especially in this moment, and I'll talk a little bit more tomorrow in our workshop, not to be a downer, but as Dick alluded to, as we're looking ahead to this election, young adults were really poised to make a significant impact and turn out in significant numbers this fall. We know there are 20 million college-age voters out there, but college students around the country are their voting expectations and norms and practices are completely upended. You may have students on campus now who, as COVID rates go up, they find they're being sent home. And so the uncertainty is going to be tremendous among students. Here again, I would encourage you to see some memos, some work that's come out from the IDHE offering recommendations to faculty, something called Elections Imperatives that I actually will share tomorrow, but really amplifying, first of all, that we all need to recognize that the voter turnout rates we were hoping for, should have expected, voter turnout rates among young adults doubled between 2014 and 2018. They're really under threat this fall. However, I would say that really enhances the role that faculty can and must play this year. in a number of ways, but one thing we've done on the Rutgers campus is have prepared a short deck of PowerPoint slides, 5 or 6, that we're trying to distribute through our provost's office, through deans, because so many students now, the one definite contact they have is this with their faculty and the learning management systems that their faculty member maintains, whether it's Sakai or Canvas. So to really, where you may not have had a faculty member who would be as interested or willing in the past, this is one way to really make good use of faculty. And sometimes faculty is the hardest group of people sometimes to bring into these civic engagement efforts. It's not so difficult to get students, and sometimes it's hard to get administrators, but faculty, especially outside of the discipline of political science, they're harder to rope in and involve. So to be able to just tell them, here, these are the dates you need to give students. These are what you need to tell students to do right now. Here are the resources available. That's a great way to involve faculty. And as Catherine said, we know that universities can find us if they want to. They can find students if they want to find them. If they need to pay their tuition, they have a way to find students. So this is also an opportunity to really call upon campus administrators and say, we need you to say, Elizabeth here, recognizing that email blasts are not always effective, but recognizing that administrators know how to track down students. So if we can be telling students, hey, you need to check your voter registration status right now. You need to know where your ballot's going. And if your ballot is going to your campus address and you're not at your campus address, you need to do something about that. So I'll just pause there, but certainly, there's certainly lots of challenges right now, but some opportunities. Alison, were you going to say something?
Yeah, let me add something that it's especially important in the context of where we are with Black Lives Matter. And frankly, even before this all erupted, there were a lot of issues about diversity and access to voting and access to political engagement resources. So you should also talk to your Office of Student Diversity, whatever it may be labeled at your university, whatever it may be titled, as well as any affinity student groups, and talk to them about it, because indeed there's a lot of concern going up to this election that it is precisely students from certain minority groups, ethnic and racial minorities, that are not being included in not only this election, but frankly, in a lot of civic engagement efforts moving forward. So again, remembering we're not just talking about this fall. This fall is, very, very big right now, but we're also talking about building a long-term plan for lifelong student civic engagement, and we cannot forget about our diverse students.
Anyone else have any questions or comments they want to make before we sort of move on? It's all related to the same topic, but anyone have anything else they want to?
I want to throw one thing out there.
Yeah, go ahead. Go right ahead.
Before we do, which
Sure.
is that civic engagement, we have to remember also, is not just about national politics or state and local politics. I teach it as part of an international relations course.
Mm-hmm.
So please remember that civic engagement is by no means relegated just to certain subfields. Actually, civic engagement pedagogy, as we've demonstrated with the books, as we see in the Journal of Political Science Education, it can and should go across all subfields. We should go where the students are interested, how they enter into politics, whether it's from an international perspective, domestic perspective, local perspective. However they enter, we can then bring a civic engagement component to them.
And hands down, my most useful intern right now for American Democracy Project is my graphic arts intern. She's doing doodly videos, and she's doing all the graphics, and everything has to be online, and you need to attract people's attention. And so those skills have been critical. And for her to actually think, which she hadn't before she started working with us, of how she could actually be in the civic space using those kind of skills and developing those kind of skills. And she may or may not work for a corporation rather than some kind of civic organization, but I suspect she'll always be engaged in some way. And so you can sneak that education in and make it very valuable for other students, even if their students are in the photography program or the students are in the graphic arts program. And so working with our political science students who are doing like our online voter guide and things that nature and doing some of the class presentations, but also these students from across campus who bring different skill sets and interests can be really, really powerful in reaching out beyond the folks who are already interested in politics.
One thing we found this summer, we had an intern this summer who was fantastic at making TikTok videos. And, that is critical. I have no clue how to make a TikTok video, but I know that if we really want to be reaching out to young adults, college students, we need students who can make TikTok videos. And we had a student.
I'm envisioning a civic engagement dance now. What would our outfits look like? What would all of our poses be? And so forth.
Well, hers was how to fill out, because New Jersey for the primary this summer, and then now for the fall, we have almost a completely vote by mail process in place. A hybrid, but a lot, heavy emphasis on vote by mail. And our vote by mail process is not straightforward. It's not easy. And especially if it's the first, we know that college age students tend to vote in person or have very limited to no voting history. I know when I filled out my vote by mail ballot, there were so many times I really had to look through, read the directions 2 or 3 times, almost, tore something off I wasn't supposed to tear off. So we did a TikTok video on how to fill out your ballot correctly. That's another way that allows people to not only use their skills, whether or not they're political science majors or not, but really reach students in a way that will be applicable or interesting, engaging. I think one topic we wanted to offer an opportunity for everyone to talk about and to share some best practices was just political discussion. As Elizabeth Bennion brought up, there's a lot of good research. Elizabeth brought up the research by Nancy Thomas on campus culture, but the importance of embedding political discussion across campus, not only in your classrooms, but the understanding it's campuses where students know they're going to talk politics a lot. It's on those campuses where you really have some very engaged students turning out on election day. So, as we were preparing for this roundtable, we already were thinking how important it would be to talk about getting ready for the election, talking about the election in the classroom and across campus as we're leading up to it. But it's certainly, given the moment we're in right now and questions about whether or not we'll even know what the outcome, will we know the outcome of the election? Helping students really reflect upon the outcome of the election, whatever that election is, whatever that outcome is, being prepared to have those conversations with students. So I'd be interested in opening up to our participants, people's comfort level, their concerns when it comes to talking about politics in the classroom or across campus, either now leading up to election day or as we're digesting the results of election day. If anyone has anything they'd like to add or share.
So some people, and Cherie Strong has, if anybody knows Cherie, she actually has her students sign a contract at the beginning of class about what is civil discussion and civil debate, and that they agree to abide by certain rules. And, this is part of political science education, right? Is teaching people how to have conversations, respectful conversations about difficult issues. And that's something that we shouldn't shy away from. And unfortunately, many political scientists have shied away from that. And I don't think that that's doing our students a really good service. So think about what sort of ground rules that you set for your classes and how you yourself are modeling political discussion in terms of approaching things. Right now, everybody's on a little tripwire, right? But, moving forward and, helping them to understand how to do this, because certainly they're not getting it modeled out there in society, how to have civil discourse. The
other thing I would say is there are some resources out of IDHE for doing exactly that, but also that there's a fairly robust literature, some in the US and also in Europe in particular, about the value of an open classroom, both in terms of facilitating student learning, but also facilitating future engagement. And so where an instructor welcomes discussion and questions and different viewpoints, that this can be very powerful. And I know Diana's in this room, she's done some really wonderful and rigorous and large scale surveys about K through 12 learning, and especially junior high and high school, and what kinds of educational experiences students have and how that affects their long-term engagement. And I think those are important things for us to think about, like what are we modeling? To what extent are they able to practice those skills in the classroom? I've also had some luck with the National Issues Forums.
Mm-hmm.
They have the free guides, and they set them up so they're not either or. So instead of debating, students are deliberating. There's always at least 3 options, and they're not really each options because students will want to pick and choose, but that's part of the whole discussion. And it does get students away from trying to debate to win the point and more about, okay, where do we have common ground? And I've had my political controversies class as a whole go read and do quizzes even on the guide so they know a little bit more, and then they're distributed among the tables and even working as moderators. And then people from other classes and then other folks from the campus and community can come, and we're around the tables, and then they have these discussions. And they do have online versions now as well. So there are some useful resources that are all free, like the little video launchers and the discussions, et cetera. And so that's another neat thing. And I love that. I take that open classroom very literally, like not just in terms of the teaching, which is usually what it means and the style of teaching, but I like to have sessions where I open my classroom to the whole campus and the community. And we might have a philosophy class and a history class come, as well as people from the community who aren't even associated with the university, but just thought the topic of climate choices was interesting, or violence in our communities, or whatever we were talking about that day.
Does anyone else have experience, or maybe we should start with any apprehension as we're heading into this fall, or we're already in the fall, but talking about politics in the classroom at this moment, comfort level, concerns. Certainly one issue that often comes up, and Alison alluded to it at the beginning, is partisanship and how to be pro-democratic, lowercase d democratic, but nonpartisan. Anyone want to share how they approach it in their classroom? Laura?
Well, and it's not really, I don't have something to share exactly. It's more just a question, because there's been this fascinating move recently where we all know what's intended with the term civil discourse, but it's been appropriated in a certain way that sometimes students will hear that and hear that as let's not, race claims are off base here, we can't talk about, so that it removes things from discussion in a certain way. And I was wondering how you navigate that, the new way that students hear civil discourse in today's context, when what we want them to have is good democratic debate, but the language that we use, sometimes they hear it differently.
And I think sometimes just the use of the term civil discourse. I know a colleague at Rutgers, Brittany Cooper, writes a lot about the notion of calling something civil or encouraging civility sometimes is also used as a tool, or she refers to it as a cudgel, to sort of maintain status quo. And that sometimes, conversation should be angry and it should be passionate, and that there's value in that. So I don't know, I want to open that up to see how maybe other people approach that. It's a great question, Laura.
Yeah, so one of the things that I do is I model the debate, okay, by starting with just the questions I am asking to kind of cut right directly through that. So I do start with that. But one of my ground rules is that you can be passionate, you can be angry about something, but we don't get into personal insults and personal characterizations or character assassinations. And so I'm very explicit about that. I'm very explicit that in class is a space where we are trying out ideas. And when we speak, it may not come out right the first time. And that's why, we have to be patient with each other and understand that we're all trying to work through these very difficult issues, and we are all trying to learn. So just because somebody says this or that does not, and maybe didn't come out exactly how they want, it doesn't mean that you then slap a label on them like racist or something like that, because most of us are dealing with people who are under 30, and they're still developing, they're still learning. Hey, we've all been there. Think about some of the stupid things we've all said at different times. And so so this is part of laying out effective ground rules and modeling through your own teaching.
Anyone else on that, on how you approach it? Laura, did you have something else on that? I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say thanks. That's actually helpful, walking through the process.
Laura, I think it's such a good point, because I was actually I was even offered a few $1,000s to give a big keynote on civility. And I think it's because I've moderated so many debates and a weekly TV show where you have Republicans and Democrats and libertarians. And so people really associate me with this idea of talking across political difference and modeling that respectful dialogue. But the people who had asked me to do it, they had, and the point of the lecture would be, and then it was very, very pro civility. And I felt the way it was framed and what the takeaway point of the lecture was just not one I was willing to give in 2020 at the time of Black Lives Matter, when that word is used so often to try to shut down social justice movements and to suggest that people who are practicing any kind of disruptive politics that may be absolutely necessary and needed are told, oh, you know, as King was told, be patient, don't be so impatient, don't be so loud, you know. And so it is a real concern. And at the same time, if we just yell and scream at each other, right, we're never going to get anywhere. And so it's a delicate balance. And I was willing for sure to talk about the complexity of this and how the more radical, if you want, voices sometimes bring the cameras. Look, as soon as Minneapolis stopped burning, the cameras went away, right? They bring the cameras and make those others who were labeled radical all of a sudden moderate and worth dealing with. And so if we look at US history from the dumping of the tea in the harbor, right, there are these other forms of protest that shouldn't just automatically dismissed, even by those of us who really do support civic disobedience, that you have to be very careful how the terms are being used, by whom they're being used or abused. And that just, it didn't seem like that level of complexity was what they wanted. So I'm talking about something totally different, but I just thought that was interesting that you brought up that point, because it's something I've thought a lot about, in the way that what people are hearing when we talk about that can be very different than what we intend if we're not very careful.
And I saw Diana had her hand up. I just want to amplify. I think that's where these ground rules are so useful and helpful. I have found that very, very helpful. I've used them now pretty consistently at the beginning of semesters. Diana, I want to let you speak.
Oh, well, I'm not sure if my point is exactly, related to this discussion, but this morning, I'm not sure how many of you read this about this case at USC, where a business professor was talking about communicating, and he used Chinese, where he said in different cultural circumstances, there's different ways that you pause. I mean, it was totally non-political, but he used a phrase that he had gotten from a Chinese scholar to give an example, and he has a lot of Chinese students in his class, and so he said the word, and it sounds a little bit, it doesn't look like it phonetically that it should be this, but it sounds a little bit like the N-word. And so he didn't mean that at all. It had nothing to do with it. It was simply about how he was introducing kind of pauses that are used in business communication. It's not. And some students in his class, and so a lot that were not in his class, wrote this letter, and he's been removed from the classroom on something. This to me is, I honestly, many years ago in PS, there was a piece that I review it sometimes about how to handle these kinds of discussions and where you should position yourself, whether be upfront and say, this is your perspective, but I respect everything that you have to say, or try to be neutral. It has 3 different scenarios and everything. And I'm always the one that, we're adults here. This is the real world. And this is my position. I will respect your, right to express, and please push back at me, and so that we can have a more robust. When I've been reading more of these kinds of examples, and now with all of our classes being recorded in a way that the the recordings can sometimes be manipulated. I hate to put it that way, but we've had instances in my own institution with that, and it kind of, to me, it's having a chilling effect on. I'm constantly thinking more than I should be. Is this going to be misinterpreted by somebody in this class who's going to write a letter that's going to have me removed from the classroom? And I'm not sure how we deal with that, given the times. But when I read that this morning,
especially when you're seeing the prevalence of provocateurs, also, sort of targeting campuses. Also, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Alison.
I was going to say, so for example, I was really pushing that exact concern here on my campus in June, because, again, I play devil's advocate sometimes in class. And so, how that can be taken out of context, oh my gosh, I can't even remember, one student, just earlier this week in a class discussion is saying, I was just saying that some people believe this, but not that I believed it. And he was kind of after class like, oh my God, what if somebody, takes this out of context? So, so what I got put into our syllabi was language that you cannot share. You cannot legally share any of this information. It is protected. It is protected speech. In the state of Maryland, we also have rules that you can't record somebody without their permission and share it. You can't do it. And so, so I pushed for more language in our syllabi where, yes, if somebody's going to do it, we cannot 100% prevent that. But if they do share it without the permission of every single person in the class, then they can be legally prosecuted. And that tends to give people some pause just to know that's there. And I said that the first day of class, and then I said it again recently. So that, again, if, as Elizabeth Bennion put, not every state has that rules, but, I put it in my syllabus, and this is part of my institution's rules. I pushed for these precisely to protect this kind of speech. And I don't agree with that. I know some national groups are encouraging recording and sharing and shaming. But in my case, they can get in a lot of legal trouble for it. So I encourage you, if you don't have it in your syllabi for this semester, that you think about it for next semester, or you think about, establishing a ground rule along those lines. Because, again, our students are developing their ideas. They're coming to our classes precisely to learn and develop and explore ideas. And we need to allow them and afford them that opportunity to do that in a safe and protected environment.
And I would say, one thing that's challenging, though, too, is, and I think talk about professional development and teaching civic engagement, most of us have had to teach ourselves or had to learn on our own, how do you moderate a political discussion? So I think there are probably plenty of examples of faculty doing a really rotten job. We want people to be doing, to be encouraging and facilitating political discussions. We also know that it takes training, it takes professional development. And I don't think, any professional development I've gotten on it, I've had to seek out. But I think, I think that's sort of an ongoing call we all are always issuing regarding teaching civic engagement, that certainly learning how to engage in political discussion, students need to do that, but also faculty need to be taught how to do that. Dick, I think I interrupted you.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, we do have other tools that we should keep in mind and use. One of them is outside speakers. So we don't have to advocate everything as a devil's advocate or as our own advocate. And some are just surprising. For instance, I invite in the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, and my students are stunned when they learn that these homeless people are really, actually, some of them have been actual former students from our campus and things like that. But also, it's a good way to get minorities really good spokesmen. You can, take congressmen who are minority members or people who head political movements and have them come in, and they get to make their case. You do need to make sure you invite both Republicans and Democrats and so on and so forth, but that part is not as difficult. And so I think bringing diverse points of view argued strongly by people who are advocates and still having a respectful circumstance is a simple tool that doesn't require a whole lot other than the difficulty of, rounding up the speakers. The other thing I think people are surprised at is I have some of the most powerful people in the state come to my class, and it's not just because I might have met them or they know me. I've had my former students who are now professors at other universities and who are not known to them invite congressmen and state legislators and former governors and so on and so forth, people who had health departments and whatever. And often they will actually show up. And in the Zoom world, it's actually easier to get them because it's easier to get on their schedule. And they don't have to come to your campus. They can
cheaper.
Just, sit there in front of the Zoom camera. So I just remind you, there are a lot of tools that are really simple that we don't always think about employing for maximum effect. I don't think having a single speaker in is very useful. But if you bring in 10 speakers or some other equivalent, and they're representing wide points of view, and the students are prepped beforehand and know something about the topic, and to ask questions during and maybe to reflect in discussion group afterwards, such a simple thing can be so powerful.
I also think sometimes empowering students to moderate these discussions, certainly again with plenty of preparation, and I think that's where the ground rules are so helpful also. We frequently use Socratic circles, and possibly people on this call have used Socratic circles, but the idea of you take, maybe there's an introductory reading that students have to do, or you tackle a topic and they physically sit in a circle, and I sit outside the circle and don't participate in the conversation, but it's students themselves who are moderating and managing the conversation. I think, again, when we can be putting students in the driver's seat, learning by doing, that's always a meaningful, I shouldn't say always, hopefully is going to be a meaningful learning opportunity. So we only have about 10 minutes left. I see, I see if is there anyone else who wants to add something? Yeah, Catherine?
She typed it in the chat. How do you involve your students in the communities that your students are situated in? Yes, Catherine, you're in Portland. Oh my goodness.
Yes.
We can only imagine the situations that you're facing right now. And I love that label, let knowledge serve the city. In my case, I have a very untraditional way. So my class is in international relations. And what I do is I run a Model United Nations for local high school students, and the class works with that Model UN. And so they take what they're learning about the United Nations and about civic engagement, and they actually bring it to the conference for the high schoolers. They also, and I have a piece in Journal of Political Science Education which goes into the intricacies of it, and be happy to talk to you about it some other time. But they also go into the high schools and they teach a high school social studies class about the global local connections about a topic of their choosing. So say if it's about global environmental issues or World Health Organization or whatever it is. So they're actually learning and researching about the global local connections. And then they're going to the community and disseminating their own research about the global local connections to high schools.
And Alison, I'm just putting in the chat, a reminder to everyone. And I think there's not only to that question about Portland State, but I think Veronica may have had one also, some best practices for different types of campuses. Certainly, we've been talking about the Teaching Civic Engagement books, but Journal of Political Science Education, the PSE newsletter, the Political Science Education section has a newsletter, years and years worth of newsletters that are actually posted on the Teaching Civic Engagement website. So what's really nice about that newsletter is there's a lot of really good, just best practices. It's not a peer-reviewed journal, so it's an opportunity for people to say, here's something I tried on my campus, here's something that I tried on my campus. You might find that a nice resource also. On the subject of this election in particular, if you haven't already heard about Raise the Vote, Raise the Vote campaign is a campaign of the American Political Science Association that I think, I think those of us in the political science education section and those of us such as Dick Simpson, I do want to point out Dick Simpson in particular, who've really been sounding this call to action for faculty on their campuses to be encouraging their students to participate in elections. It's a series of short articles, very accessible articles about how to be doing this work of voter engagement on your campus, offering best practices, evidence-based best practices, usually with a good reading list also, or bibliography, so you can go back and look at the scholarly article that prompted that best practice. So that's another resource I'd encourage everyone to look at. I've actually assigned some of those to my students, some of the Raise the Vote briefs to my students also. It's a nice little primer for them on these different topics that we address. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm wondering if there's some things that haven't been discussed. I've lost track of the chat. If anyone has anything in particular that they want to mention, or questions they want to ask, resources they want to share. I'll pause.
I would just comment that a lot of what we've been talking about are indeed done. My campus is a commuter camp, or was originally a commuter campus, and a lot of my former graduates teach at community colleges. All of these techniques, although they have to be adjusted for how they're done in these different circumstances, all of these civic engagement activities can be adjusted for different political circumstances depending on the kind of campus you have. So you shouldn't, think, well, we can't possibly do civic engagement. That's only for R1 universities or something. No, it's for all kinds of universities, and all kinds of faculty have done them. In fact, there's probably more done at four-year colleges and community colleges than at the highfalutin R1 universities.
Let me echo that. My campus is a primarily commuter campus, for example. So, and in our books, where we give examples, most of the campuses are not R1 and R2 campuses. So they're more, these books are really pitched to where the majority of the students are. And you can cherry pick. Feel free to cherry pick. That's, kind of how I started is I looked at what different people were doing around, and I cherry picked a little bit of this idea from here, a little bit from there, and a little bit from somewhere else, and make it your own. It's kind of like making stew, right? You look in the fridge and you see what you got, sometimes, and that's what winds up being dinner. So don't be afraid to experiment, and again, go even from subfields that aren't your own, and cherry pick ideas.
And Elizabeth Bennion posted in the chat box another resource that is helpful is the APSA Educate, which is the fairly new, in the last year, a new resource put out. Again, some nice tips and syllabi and templates, so you are not, creating this on your own. There's plenty of guidance out there.
Yeah, they're calling it a online teaching library for the APSA.
Right. Anyone else have anything they want to add before we wrap up? Or if people, and maybe even if it's a temperature check, how are people feeling about teaching civic engagement right now this semester? Especially now we've been in class about a week or two, but I know there's some variety. What are people seeing when they're meeting with their students and trying to engage them in the election or in politics right now?
At UCSD, we haven't started yet.
So okay.
We start at the end of the month, but of course we're talking about this, and I'm sensing among my colleagues a real reluctance. Nobody wants to touch it. I actually am on sabbatical this year, so I'm not teaching, but I'm still director of undergraduate studies. And so I really want to move forward with trying to figure out how to get my colleagues to feel a little bit more comfortable about all of this. So I think if I can make it easy for them, here's a few slides, just, once a week, put a slide in. But I think people are even more fearful than usual for the reasons that have been raised, that their lectures are being recorded, that it's just completely out of their comfort zone. So and some will be more easily persuaded perhaps than others. But
You know, I think you're right, Maureen, but that's where, you know, in terms of persuading colleagues and so forth, you know, any one of us can give a guest talk at your university about these issues, or do, you know, bring our
Remotely
workshop
now,
on the road.
Zoom.
Yeah, remotely, so we can bring our workshop on the road for different institutions. We've already, you know, done some of this. And so sometimes getting outsiders to come in and say, here's what you can do and here's how to do it, can be helpful in persuading people that, you know, so it's not all on you as the cheerleader at your institution. It can also help bring in deans who have the resources to help support these kinds of projects and this kind of teaching. So, so don't be afraid to
Okay,
ask.
well, that's fantastic to know, because I've already been thinking about this, and as you said,
Oh,
this is, well, that it's yes, this election in particular is critically important, but we are thinking beyond that in terms of really integrating this into our curriculum for the long haul. And so I need to do some more reading myself, these fantastic resources that you've put forward, but I would love to work with some of you who are just so experienced in this. And I do think my colleagues are open-minded. It's just, it's part of a cultural shift. They're not used to this, and it needs to be made easy in a way. And yeah, so thank you.
So I'm going to put Terry Gilmore on the spot because she offered something positive in her chat. So maybe she'll end us on a positive note by mentioning, and I think someone else mentioned something, Veronica maybe, trying to be optimistic right now as we're looking into the fall and some of the benefits actually of teaching civic engagement right now remotely. So Terry, I'm going to make you take us out on a positive note.
Well, I can try. You know, I mean, the last 6 months have just been challenging in so many different ways. I think that some of the positives that came out of it for me is that it did give me some time to work on things and to hopefully to improve things. I spent a whole lot of time really improving the online portions of it and trying to make it more interesting, try to make it more engaging, trying to make it, you know, just where building rapport with the students. And really with the technology that we have now, we can do that. And I'm encouraged about that.
Good. But let's go out on an encouraging note, Terry.
Okay. And please come to the political science education business meeting in about an hour.
Good. That's what
come meet the other people interested in this.
Right.
But let me tell y'all, just you know, remember that I'm not somebody who came to teaching with this in mind. I'm one of the converted. I am not part of the choir. I actually got converted by my own students and by my own community into this. So so that they're the ones who brought it to me and said, this is something we want and need. So don't think that, you know, you have to start from the beginning or any of your colleagues have to start from the beginning. You can have converts, and I am proof of that.
And I think, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, Elizabeth.
What time zone is that? 6:30 time?
I just put it in there at 6:30 Eastern Standard Time. So 1 hour from right now.
1 hour.
And then I would just sort of end where we began by saying, you know, we are in a tumultuous moment right now in American history, in American politics, but that's why we signed up for this job. And I think if ever there were a semester where we need to be vocally screaming from the rooftops and teaching democratic education, teaching democratic citizenship, this is the semester to do it. So there's some great resources out there, and you've got a community out there also to tap into. So I really hope we can all kind of heed that call to action right now, because I think it's really more important than ever.